long time, China has been one of the most controversial countries in terms of human rights violations. Since China has been run by one party since 1949, it's been under massive debate about how a single party would be better protecting human rights or violating them. Because of the lack of democracy, most of the data and cases about human rights remain state secrets. The most famous examples of human rights violations in China include the one-child policy, forbidding citizens to vote, suppressing freedom of speech, and detaining religious movement. In Tibet, also known as Qingzang in Chinese, where Buddhism plays a huge role in people's life, numerous monks have been imprisoned. Some escaped to the US, while others are prosecuted. There were protests throughout the country, but no effective actions have been made to address these issues. It seems like there is no way for the people to speak out. Because of this, China has been receiving a lot of pressure from the outside world. Throughout 2016, the United States, the European Union, and other world powers released a series of joint statements expressing their growing concern over China's respect for human rights.
Outside pressures and criticisms towards China's human rights violations have ultimately been ineffective in changing their policies. Especially with the US, they will continue to be ineffective in changing China. China does not necessarily feel the urge to listen since the political atmosphere and ideologies are different. These two superpowers are natural competitors based on their power positions within the world. China sticks to their ideology, and their sense of pride is a part of it.
Looking back at the history, communism was important to the success of China because of their war situation with Japan in the early 1900s. It served as the only way to free the people and strengthen the country. It is necessary to maintain the one-party dictatorship for the sake of social stability, economic and cultural development.
关注来自外交部例行记者会上的消息。据报道，10号，美国驻华大使布兰斯塔德就世界人权日发表声明，一方面承认中国在许多领域取得了发展进步，包括使数亿人口摆脱了贫困；另外一方面又说不认同各国有自己的人权标准，并对中国人权状况进行无端的指责。对此，在今天的中国外交部例行记者会上，外交部发言人陆康进行了回应。
我们注意到，正如你刚才所说，布兰斯塔德大使他也承认中国取得了大进步。我们希望美方人士呢也能够认真的、客观的看待中国人民自己选择的发展道路和促进人权事业的途径。我们觉得，带着偏见是无法准确认识其他国家，并且增进互信的。以为自己的标准就是放之四海而皆准的，是盲目的，并且呢，坦率地讲，已经在世界许多地方证明是。
China sees the US in particular as a hypocrite, so they're less inclined to receive direct criticism from them. When the US wrote a report about the human rights violations in China in 2014, and more recently in 2018, China responded with their own statement about how the US violates human rights as well.
They cite things such as high gun violence, racism, sexism, income inequality, and more recently, the declining in the freedom of the press with Donald Trump. There is also the problem where the United States refuses to listen to China, so China feels no pressure to listen either.
So Longbin, what's your opinion that the United States has been ineffective in its effort of changing China?
Actually, in fact, so the U.S. has had some success in changing China. Some examples are the South China Sea. The United States applied military force, and it actually helped to maintain freedom of navigation, and China backed off. And another example is that the United States successfully reduced government database attacks from China by threatening economic sanctions. However, the reason that the United States cannot change China in the realm of human rights is that the United States has historically prioritized its own national interests over China's human rights violations. So the United States has power to change, but it chooses not to.
Okay, so can you give an example of how United States has prioritized, as you said, its national interest over like China human rights?
Yeah, so going back about 40 years, this goes back to the President Nixon's administration. So Nixon was faced with the challenge of helping the Muslims in China that were forced to go to re-education camps. And however, the administration avoided involvement since it would hurt relations with China. And similarly, Nixon avoided talking about sensitive topics such as Taiwan in preference of maintaining the relationship with China.
I see. I didn't know that before.
Some argue that the pressure has been effective. China has been granting more human rights. For example, the one-child policy has been lifted. There's a stronger free market and a stronger education.
Unfortunately, in some aspect, China is becoming tighter in its grips, so the idea that China has been granting more human rights is incorrect in some areas. For example, China has been putting big efforts in counter-corruption, but some speculate that it is an action for Xi Jinping to settle social unrest and to strengthen its control within the party. In the areas that are freeing up, these changes are not the result of outside pressure, but rather the result of increased stability and growth in the country. Once the stability is established, China is able to lift some of these restrictions. One example is that the one-child policy has been lifted in favor of the new two-child policy.
China's view on human rights and what is acceptable highlights a complexity in international affairs. There will always be differing ideologies, and other countries must handle it with sensitivity and care. The United States' pressure on China has been ultimately unsuccessful in changing their policies. These upcoming years, the U.S. has a chance to change their foreign policy and truly enact change in China if they care enough. As Americans, there are several things we can do. Out of fairness, we should look at our own society from an outside lens to identify human rights violations in our own country. Being a global citizen, or someone living in this new globalized world, there are many different factors to consider.